I don't know exactly where to begin with this bill. I've got a lot to say about it, and I want to go through the language of the bill as well. I guess I'll start by saying, just, for the record, we're discussing a bill, Senate Bill 414, an act concerning equity in state government, in state employment, rather. And effectively what this bill is going to do is it's going to mandate the hiring of, I don't know the exact number, somewhere around 25 DEI directors, coordinators, commissioners, I don't know what they will be ultimately called, throughout state government. They will be highly paid individuals, and they will certainly be hired for the purpose of making sure that the policies of the state government, and in fact there's a section in the bill that says that they will have the ability to review every policy in every department, in every agency, before they actually occur, to put their DEI spin on it. That's what the bill is before us. It's going to be extremely expensive. It's going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money, and I'm afraid that it is going to further divide our state and our nation. And that's where I start on this proposal. And I'll simply just put it this way, which is that there is a tremendous divide in our country politically, and there are a few different divisions, but one of them is a very clear one, and that is between people that, I'll preface it by saying that I think there's a legitimate desire from people on both sides of this equation to eliminate race and gender-based discrimination, and they both believe that they are doing it in the proper way. The fact of the matter is that objectively only one of them can be correct. And I'm going to make the case that this particular policy that is before us is the incorrect way to go about that, and that ultimately it will lead only to more discrimination and more division in our country. There are people like myself that are unapologetically colorblind. I believe that there is only one race. It is the human race, and that people should not be judged based on superficial things. Judging people based on color is as stupid as judging them based on their eye color or their shoe size or any other ridiculous superficial characteristic about the size of their nose or their ears, etc. It's ridiculous and dumb on its face. And people that continue to treat other people in a different way based on those superficial characteristics are small people who clearly have not thought it through. There's a lot to say about this whole topic because it involves a discussion of human history, and particularly America's history over the last couple hundred years, which I'm going to try and stay away from today. But inevitably, it has to be some part of the conversation. My concern about this is that my view, which is that people should be colorblind based on the reasons I just stated, that we are one race and that we should not judge people based on superficial characteristics, is one point of view. The other point of view is the one expressed by the chairman in her remarks bringing out this bill and the purpose of the bill before us, which is that there are folks who believe that the only way to resolve the inequities of the past is to create inequities in the future. And that's what this bill intends to do, and that will be quite clear. I'll state from the outset that I think this bill is unconstitutional on its face. I believe the Supreme Court, in their recent decision regarding affirmative action, already laid out the reasons why, which is that you cannot promote or deny people access to things based on these superficial characteristics. This bill clearly does that. If there's any doubt about that, I will dispel that before this conversation is over. I can promise you that. And I'm going to have a lot more to wrap up with, but I think what we should do is go through the bill first. And I'll start by asking the first question, which is, Madam Chairman, Section 1 defines what, it's basically just definitions, but it lays out which departments will be required to have a DEI department head, or director, rather, of DEI. Can you tell me, you can list them if you choose, but it might take you a while. Can you tell me how many state departments there are?
How many state departments there are that are not mentioned? You know, the total number of state departments, or are you talking about those mentioned in this bill?
The ones that are impacted by this legislation.
I can count them. I believe the count is 26. But if you have other, I would defer to you because I'm sure you've already counted them.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, no, it's a difficult thing to count because you're basically counting commas because some of our state departments have lengthy names. But I'm going to rely on the article that I recently saw actually, I don't have the publication in front of me. I want to say it was Inside Investigator, but I don't know that it was. Yes, that's who it was, Connecticut Inside Investigator. They say there's 24 in the bill. So it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 to 26. And as was mentioned, it's subject to change. I think that's interesting because, you know, we were told that this legislation is a direct result of the creation of a state, I don't think it's an agency, the Commission on Racial Equity and Public Health that was created by some legislation, I think, in 2021. And they're the ones that came up with this recommendation to create this policy. But they were charged with creating a policy that addressed equity across racial differences in the area of public health. But I'm looking at the list of departments where we're going to install these DEI directors, and I discover places that have very little to do with public health. DAS, aging and disability, maybe. Agriculture, children and families, maybe. Consumer protection, no. Corrections, possibly. Developmental services, possibly. Economic and community development, I would say no. Education, DSSPP. Energy, environmental protection, insurance, labor, mental health, addiction services, motor vehicle department, you know, and again, there's more. So 24 to 26 state departments that will have DEI directors, allegedly because of disparities in outcomes regarding public health, and yet there are many, many state agencies that have very little to do with the subject of public health altogether. Can you tell me why these other state departments would be included based on that premise, Madam Chairman?
I'm not sure I agree with the premise because I believe that the Public Act that was passed tasked the Commission on Racial Equity and Public Health with reporting best practices that state agencies can implement to reduce racial inequities and dismantle structural racism within state government. So I don't believe it was confined to public health.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I will take your word for that because I have not gone back to look at the actual charge that they were given. I just am looking at the name of their commission as guidance, and it's Commission on Racial Equity and Public Health. So I'm very tempted to ask you about structural racism, but maybe we'll get there later. I'll start by talking about the definition of equity, which is on line 28 through 36. I'll read it. I don't like to read, but I want people who are listening to know what the bill actually says. And that it reads, equity means the consistent and systemic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. If you just stop there, I would be more than happy. I might support this bill and co-sponsor it. But it goes on to say, who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, women, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. And the reason why I take issue with this is because we do not in America write laws based on groups. That's just not how we operate. We recognize that every person is an individual in America, and they are individually sovereign, and they have God-given rights that are protected by our Constitution, state and federal. And this bill throws that out the window and categorizes people by, in many cases, superficial characteristics or at least unrelated characteristics. To say that someone is underserved or been denied fair treatment just because they happen to be any of these things, I don't think you can say as a blanket statement. You can say that historically, different communities based on those superficial characteristics may have had different experiences, but that's true today, and that's true for everyone. And not everyone from each one of these groups is facing the same experience. Can I ask why, Madam Chairman, why these particular groups were chosen?
I do want to point out that, just to be clear, and I know that you know this, but the way you stated it, you left out an important word in the piece of legislation, because it says all individuals, including. And that word is important because it still covers all individuals, but it specifically addresses these particular groups. And you asked the question, why these? Because I think that there's been, upon this commission, made this recommendation because I believe they found in their examination of state employment and the work that they did that these were groups of people that we need to particularly acknowledge may not always receive equitable treatment.
Well, I appreciate the term equitable treatment, but I would ask equitable treatment by whom? And I'd look for an example of that. And I would also ask you to provide for me something that would suggest that all people within any of these groups experience that same disparate treatment.
I don't have that information handy. There is a lengthy report from the commission, and it might shed some light on that specifically, but in any case, I don't have any specific examples to offer at this time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Yeah, I would say the larger reason why you're unable to provide that information is because it's just simply not true. I mean, the fact of the matter is there are people that have experienced great disparities in the way they've been treated, either unfairly or truly graced in their lives, of all different backgrounds, either by virtue of being born into a wealthy family or a impoverished family. But that does not fall across any specific racial or gender lines, or based on living in a rural area. I can understand that the way that this bill was written was to try and paint a picture that somehow the data that we might be able to craft regarding the experience of Americans based on these categories might be disparate. But as I mentioned, we can't write laws based on the disparate treatment of even a majority of people in certain groups, because you cannot say with any certainty that it applies to all the members of those groups. There are certainly very successful and wealthy people in all of these categories, and many of them worked very hard to achieve that on their own, and others may have been born into wealth because of their families. But the fact that we are dividing people up into these categories and suggesting that by virtue of being in one of these categories, you have had some sort of life experience which separates you from the rest of the human race, I think is discrimination on its face. You know, one of the things that drove me into politics, and one of the things that still drives me, is that I love this country dearly, and our founding principles, which are beautiful, have still not been realized. And in 1776, they were much more of a dream than they are today. We could be so close to realizing the words in the Declaration that Jefferson wrote so eloquently, by recognizing that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there's no distinction between peoples based on their race or gender or other superficial characteristics. Now, obviously, slavery existed during that period, and this country went through unbelievable hell to end the practice of slavery, which was wrong and horrific. The very first time it was put into practice in this nation, in the English colonies before it, and around the world. The fact of the matter is, though, we did go through that process, and that certainly didn't solve the problem of discrimination, and it still continues today in some shapes, and people are not always treated fairly. But that goes across many, many, many boundaries, and there's no one specific group of people that can say without a shadow of a doubt that all persons in that group are subject to disparate treatment, or that that other groups are not. And that's kind of what I'm driving at here, which is that, you know, maybe I just simply put it as, you know, at this point, we have done a great deal to make our laws so that they do apply equally. And we've worked hard to outlaw disparate treatment in our laws. And if there still remains inequities in our society, I would say many of them are a direct result of government involvement. And I can point to the way government policies create dependency and impoverish segments of the population as my concern about the way people are treated unfairly, or what I would describe as structural racism. But the bottom line is you cannot suggest that all the members of these groups were underserved or denied fair, just, or impartial treatment, because it's just not true. And I really would like someone to be able to come to me and provide some proof about how it applies to every person in every group and why we should treat the folks that fall into these categories differently than people that do not. I also have looked through this, and I think I'm trying to think of another categories that are not included, and those are clearly limited. The next section is a definition about implicit bias, which they have defined in the bill as an attitude or internalized stereotype that affects a person's perceptions, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner and often contributes to unequal treatment of a person based on the factors of race, ethnicity, gender identity, and so on. I don't doubt that implicit bias exists, but this bill tends to imply that implicit bias only works in one direction, and that only serves to disenfranchise people in the groups that are mentioned. And I don't believe that is accurate also. The next section defines underserved community. again, I'm going through this because I just want you folks to think about the fact that, our laws are not for communities. We don't write laws that way. Our laws have got to apply to all people equally. That's part of our fabric, which is that we don't put people into groups. We try and treat all people equally, and that everyone should have the same opportunity in our country, and they should have the same treatment under our laws. And they shouldn't be given adverse or special treatment based on any of these superficial characteristics. But they define underserved community as populations sharing a particular characteristic and geographical communities that have been systemically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life, and go through the same list of individuals. But there are lots of people that have been denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life because they were born in a poor neighborhood. But that has very little to do with their race. The meat of the bill begins on page 3 on line 51, where we establish the DEI division, which will be administered by a full-time salaried director who shall be subject to the supervision and direction of the department head or constitutional officer. Just want to talk about something here that's kind of like off topic, but I think very, very important for people to recognize, because what I see in this bill is that this bill is nothing more than a way to create some high-paying jobs for some particularly woke progressive government officials at great cost to the taxpayers. In fact, that article that I mentioned points out that in our college university system in the state of Connecticut, they have 34 full-time and 37 part-time employees working in as DEI staff to the tune of $4.2 million, which I think is tremendously ironic because I know I don't serve on appropriations anymore, thank heavens. I did my time there. But the fact of the matter is that I know that this same college university system is before the Appropriations Committee regularly talking about how they need funding, that they are short on funding, that they need money to continue their operations. Well, here's $4.2 million. This article points out that this Southern Connecticut State University spends $809,366 in 2023 on DEI staff. Eastern, $530,000. And UConn, $537,207 in salary costs. Not to mention that the commission that is sending us this bill, they're also funded to the tune of $291,714. These folks are claiming to be focused on adding to the diversity and equity of our state, but I don't think that they're adding to the diversity and equity of thought and ideas. I doubt any one of these people could be identified as a Republican. And really, that's what is important, the diversity of our ideas, the diversity of our stereotypes and skin color, as I said, is something for small people to quabble over. And to be putting it into our laws is going backwards. I encourage my colleagues to actually go back and read the civil rights legislation that's been passed over time, because I think that what they'd recognize that what we're doing here is the exact antithesis of that civil rights legislation. That civil rights legislation was all geared toward the same thing, which was to judge people based on their character and their capabilities and on merit, and to discourage disparate treatment based on superficial qualities. These DEI policies are all about treating people differently based on superficial qualities. And we're paying people mountains of money to do so. So let's talk about what these DEI directors are going to be responsible for. Line 61 says they'll be responsible for all equity-related matters within the department. Can I ask what an equity-related matter might be, Madam Chairman?
I think you would want to go back and look at the definition of equity, and it would relate to anything mentioned in that definition. Fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that. It goes on to say in small letter C that the director shall be responsible for coordinating the department's equity initiatives, serving as a subject matter expert. Interesting, they'll be charged with producing something called an equity plan, which we'll find out about momentarily, evaluating the policies, including the training and hiring practices of the department, evaluating outcomes of services provided by the department, collecting and using data from the department relevant to the division, supporting the department in creating and sustaining inclusive cultures and behaviors. Madam Chairman, how would that work? How could the director be responsible for supporting the department in creating and sustaining inclusive cultures and behaviors? And can you describe for me what that means?
I believe that the intent here is to ensure that and I think when it's referenced culture, they mean there are cultures within workplaces that can be embracing and inclusive, meaning that everyone's positions taken into account, everyone is heard and paid attention to, and there are other cultures where people are very divided or some people are very left out. And I think the idea here is to make sure that we're also recognizing what has now become known as a culture of a given work site, given workplace.
Well, I can appreciate that, Madam Chairman. I'm just trying to get my head around all of these responsibilities. I mean, we already found out they're going to collect data, and apparently they can collect any kind of data they want. It says including but not limited to, much like the other section that you referenced. And I don't know what the data collection is for. And I also don't know how to define some of these terms. I mean, what would be considered an inclusive culture and behavior versus a non-inclusive culture and behavior? I'm just curious what that means.
I think it is a broad term that will allow the diversity directors to really gain information from people about whether they think it's a hostile workplace or it's a workplace that's hostile based on some of the equity criteria that we've outlined in the bill, particularly.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I mean, I appreciate your response, and you're doing the best you can to try and answer my questions. And I know that these are difficult questions because these are broad terms, and I don't think that they're very clearly laid out. Would it be safe to say that, that the intent of this bill is by suggesting that they are charged with and responsible for supporting the department in creating and sustaining inclusive cultures and behaviors, that they are going to be determining the makeup of the various departments that they are employed as directors over, to make sure that they appear diverse culturally based on the definition of equity?
I think that the intent is to make sure that every department that's listed here has an individual whose job it is, whose purpose and job it is to really examine relationships in the workplace, gather the data such that it is as it exists, to bring together both data and anecdotal observations to try and make sure that our workplaces throughout the state, and it's a huge state, and there are a lot of workers in a lot of different working circumstances, to make sure that we're intentional and have somebody whose job it is to make sure that we're doing everything we can to have a very fair and just work site for every worker.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I find it ironic that you're suggesting that we should be granting this person who is going to have so much influence over the workplace and the determination of how it appears and what the results are, that they would be granted such broad authority based on anecdotal evidence and their own judgment, when almost every bill we have here is telling people in the private sector that they've got to jump through 1,000 hoops and fill out forms, etc.
Can I just, I think I want to stand corrected that anecdotal is probably the wrong way to frame it, and I'm not sure, it's not what I intended to say. What I meant, and maybe I'm struggling to find the right word, is that there are observations you can make in a workplace by having someone whose responsibility is to examine relationships in the workplace and both look at relationships as well and look at the conduct and what's happening in that workplace in addition to the data behind it. So you're not strictly looking at data, but you're also looking at the actual reality of that workplace. And it is a huge job, and I think it's a difficult job to do. So I recognize that we're very ambitious in trying to make these changes.
I appreciate the insight, Madam Chairman. I think that the conversation we're having has very little to do with what the words in the bill actually say. And that's the part that I'm concerned about more than anything, because this doesn't say anything about fair and just. It says inclusive. And that means that there is an attempt here to create an environment based on other criteria, and I'm just trying to understand what that is. I would prefer that it simply said fair and just and impartial, but it doesn't say that. If that's our actual goal, that we want to be fair and just and impartial and judge people based on their experience, their skill set, and their ability to add to a particular position, and that might include life experience, the ability to speak a foreign language, etc. I'm not denying any of those things. But what I am suggesting is that should be the criteria that we are determining how we are going to hire our state's workforce, not on some notion of what is diverse or inclusive because the individuals involved all have superficial characteristics. As I pointed out, that's discrimination. Let's just move on from there. I think it's section little d of section 1 where it says, prior to implementing any proposed department policy or adopting any proposed regulation. I mean, now we're talking about a lot of stuff here. This is like everything the department does, every decision the commissioner makes. In accordance with the provisions of Chapter 54 of the General Statutes, the department head or constitutional officer shall, not may, shall consult with the DEI director to ensure that the proposed policy or regulation will not have an indirect or direct adverse impact on any underserved communities. And again, Madam Chairman, it does not say to make sure that the proposed policy or regulation will be fair and impartial. It says to determine whether it will have an indirect or direct adverse impact on any underserved communities. That to me implies that it could be very unfair and very partial as long as it doesn't result in a indirect or direct adverse impact. But this is broad power that we are going to be granting folks who will now effectively, the way I see it, they will be co-commissioners. That's what it's going to be. So the governor's going to appoint commissioners to our various state agencies, presumably based on their expertise in particular areas. But they're going to be filtered in their actions and activities through the lens of DEI. A lens, like I said, which only a very small portion of society, I think, agrees with. And I look forward to being argued on that point, because I think if we start asking people on the street the very straight up question whether or not we should judge people based on merit or superficial qualities, I bet you I win that conversation every time. Section number 2. This says that the director, the co-commissioner for each department, shall create an equity action plan for such department that identifies specific diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Madam Chairman, can you tell me what one of those goals might be?
I think the goals are to make sure that we are intentional in every department, in every action that we take, whether it's hiring, whether it's promotional opportunities, or whether it's how we serve the public, that we are intentional about making sure that our workforce and the way we're conducting the work really reflect the population of our state, which is quite diverse, and that we mirror the diversity, that we truly represent the people of the state of Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. So you're suggesting that this section means that they will be creating an equity plan that intentionally requires the mirroring of the state's population in the makeup of the people that are employed in the state agency?
I didn't say the makeup, I said in the work of it. That could be, in fact, the way we address the public. It could be, I believe that the equity plans, or action plans, are supposed to be broad in nature and make sure that we are conscious of the way we do the work, who we hire, who we promote, and the way we do the work, the impact it has on our communities, and that we want it to be representative of the people that live in the state of Connecticut.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but again, you said who we hire, and that's what this bill is all about. It's about who we are hiring. This bill is all about hiring practices. And you're suggesting that we are going to be intentional about who we hire to either mirror the state or to make it quote unquote inclusive. And I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Does that mean that overrides the necessity of having qualified personnel?
I don't think there's anything that says in this proposed legislation that would override qualifications.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. But wouldn't that, based on this conversation, mean that you would have failed to reach your equity goal if you prioritized the meritorious hiring of people over the desire for inclusion?
I think if a person is qualified, it's always going to be required that the person is qualified for the job that we're trying to fill or for the promotional opportunity that exists. So I don't think that we would ever be suggesting that a person that is not qualified or be promoted or hired. And I don't think there's anything in this proposed legislation that suggests that. I don't think there's anything that directs the department directors to create equity action plans that would include the need to hire people or promote people that are not qualified.
I appreciate that, Madam Chairman. Thank you very much, because that's a relief to know that we're simply not going to be hiring people based on superficial qualifications and replacing people that are qualified. But does it mean that we might not choose the most qualified person for the job based on an equity goal that is required after October 1st, 2026 to be created by the director as part of an equity action plan?
I think there are aspects of this bill that address hiring, also that address training. There are a lot of ways for us to approach the goal of having a more equitable state work, treating state employees more equitably and creating a more equitable workplace for state employees. There's a lot of different components of it that are addressed in this bill. I think that also we're all very much aware that for many, if not the overwhelming majority of employees within the state, there are collective bargaining agreements that address the issue of hiring and promotions, and that they do have very specific terms with regard to how an employee is selected for a job or for a promotion.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Going further, it says, that parts of the equity action plan will include identifying the progress made. And for me, that means that they're going to have to provide a report of how much equity they have advanced. And for me, that means that they are going to have to provide a report that shows how they've changed the makeup of each one of these state agencies. And I presume that's going to be measured based on the definition of equity, which is the different categories of underserved communities identified, both in the definition of equity and the definition of underserved community. It's funny, every time we have one of these conversations, I mean, you end up going in a giant circle. I mean, the debate over affirmative action, the same thing has occurred for decades about whether or not affirmative action means quotas or not, and it certainly does. There's no other way to make a distinction about whether or not you're advancing a particular population of people based on superficial characteristics, unless you're counting them. That's just what's happening, and that's what's happening here. I want to get to the hiring panels, which is coming up momentarily, and that is even more explicit about the desire to put aside the meritorious efforts of individual citizens, regardless of what they look like or where they grew up in a rural area or not, and say, hey, this person is an excellent fit for this job based on their skill set, their knowledge, their life experience, and so on, which should be the only things factored in. And I'll keep going back to that, and I will never apologize for it, Madam Chairman. If people want to come after me because I say that it's better to be colorblind, then let them come. Because that's the only truly moral way to treat other human beings. Since we cannot see into anyone's soul, we cannot understand anyone else's life experience, and we should not assume anything about other people. That's prejudice. In lines 116 through 123, just continuing on in that same section, identify how the department intends to engage with underserved communities, again, in order to advance equity. I won't keep asking the same questions, so Madam Chairman, I know they're difficult questions, but I will leave these questions hanging out there for the people listening to decide what you think it means. What do you think the people that drafted this bill meant by that? Identify training programs. Here we go. Evaluate the applicant data required and identify demographic hiring trends within the department. I mean, am I crazy to think that that's quotas on its face? That is saying we're going to figure out how many people were hired of all of these different groups, so we know what we have to do to create a more diverse workplace. I mean, it's in the title of DEI, diversity, okay? And I'm not against diversity. What I am against is diversity for the sake of diversity at the expense of any particular individual's rights or providing preferential treatment to any person, regardless of their circumstances, over another person when they actually deserve the job based on merit. And again, I think I would take that challenge to any individual in any community. And yeah, I know that there are people that buy into this stuff, but I think that it's a very small population, and most of them exist in government in the Democratic Party, not in the real world. On section number 3, each department shall collect and maintain data regarding demographic information for each individual that applies for positions with such department. Each division shall annually examine data regarding demographic information for individuals who apply for positions. What is the reason to collect this data about people's superficial characteristics, Madam Chairman?
I think collecting the data will inform us on hiring practices and hiring trends, as has been stated, and we want to look and make sure that our hiring practices are fair and just, and there are concrete things that people can do to help accomplish that, and I think that's what's outlined in the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Imagine you're me for a second here, and you come to this building every day to debate policy, and you go to the Housing Committee, and over there, they're telling people that are property owners that they cannot know characteristics about tenants that actually matter, like whether they have a violent criminal past, whether they're on the sex offender registry. Okay? You can't know that in the private sector because you might discriminate against people, even if it's for a legitimate reason, like the public safety or the safety of yourself and your other tenants. But here, it's okay for the government to go ahead and collect data about what your skin color is and what your gender is and whether you're a Native American or whether you live in a rural area, for the purpose of discriminating for or against you. The irony is insane. It is all about expanding the government power to make society in somebody's image, the people in power. It's not about making sure that people are protected and that their rights are protected, which is what we are charged with when we swear our oath of office. It also collects, they will all also be charged with collecting the data about how far people in each category progressed in the interview process. All right, so let's talk about hiring panels. Section 4, line 145. Each department shall utilize diverse hiring panels to conduct interviews for open positions with such department. Madam Chairman, what is a diverse hiring panel?
I believe that the purpose of this is to ensure that the people involved in doing the interviews have diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, identity, and those types of, those characteristics that you object to. So.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I don't object to people having characteristics. I just object to using superficial characteristics that do not determine the quality of a human being as the means for any decision making, particularly the hiring in state government. That's what I object to. But that's what this is. We're going to have a diverse hiring panel. So how do you come up with a diverse hiring panel? I asked the room rhetorically. Without being able to determine who goes on it based on these superficial characteristics. How do you do it without discriminating is the question. I'm going to build a diverse hiring panel. How do I do that without discriminating against or for certain people based on race, gender, age, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How do I do that, Madam Chairman?
I believe that there's some general flexibility given here to utilize employees from other departments if necessary. And I know I'm trying to answer your questions directly, but I do think that there has been a lot of evidence and studies that I've seen in the past that people tend to hire people that look like them based on the wrong criteria. And I think that's what we're really trying to get at. If you have a diverse panel for the hiring, that you would avoid that occurrence, which has been documented in many different studies.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm glad that you brought up this point, because I want to just address this situation head on, which is this idea that somehow, unless we have these types of policies in place where we're going to practice reverse discrimination, where we're going to actively engage in racism and discrimination for the purpose of undoing the potential of other racism and discrimination, that's ridiculous on its face, especially when you consider that the courts have already made it very clear you can't do that. We have constitutional law. We have the Civil Rights Act. We've had Supreme Court decisions that say so. And more importantly, they have pointed out that there are ways to do this without discriminating. There is a process called debiasing. Debiasing is the idea of screening the knowledge of the interviewer of certain information. It's kind of the concept of like putting in an application, but it doesn't say the age of the person. It doesn't say the race of the person. It doesn't even tell you the name of the person. It just is blind to those issues and only provides the characteristics that are meritorious towards the job that is the position is being sought for. That's a smart way to approach this, because you're actually going to judge people not based on the way they appear, based on those superficial characteristics, but by their skill set and their ability to do the job. But we don't find that anywhere in this document. The whole profession of DEI ignores the fact that there are any potential ways to combat discrimination without using discrimination, because in fact the goal of DEI is in fact discrimination. I wrote something down earlier and I want to go back to it. I wish I can find it. I know that was a bold statement, but reading this bill, every aspect of the activity that is going to be given to the DEI director tells them to discriminate. It tells them that they have to pay attention at every turn to people's characteristics based on underserved community and equity. I can't repeat enough. Looking at people based on those superficial characteristics is like the most simplistic and childlike way to look at the world. It's not only factually wrong, it's also morally wrong. The creation of these hiring panels, even if they were to result in producing a more diverse workforce, even if they did that in a completely fair and just way, which I know is the focus that the chairman and I think ultimately agree upon, the creation of the hiring panel itself cannot be fair and just. The last section, I think it's the last section. No, there's 5 and 6. But 5 has to do with developing a standardized diversity, equity, and inclusion training program. And this program shall be used by the department in completing the DEI training required. And it should include, but not need be limited to, how to recognize and mitigate unconscious implicit biases. Can I ask, Madam Chairman, how would one mitigate someone's unconscious implicit bias?
I think the training would address it by not only getting us to recognize unconscious bias, but also ways to, as the legislation says, mitigate against it, ways that you can overcome it. Because hopefully the whole purpose of this is that when people identify these unintended biases, that they can find ways to overcome them.
Do you think it's possible, Madam Chairman, that these highly paid, certainly progressive DEI directors that will be hired by the state might have implicit biases?
I assume that we're going to be hiring people who have worked at overcoming any implicit bias that they might have. And certainly are aware of what they have as in terms of implicit bias. You know, I've been through some of these trainings, and I think people who do the trainings are very conscious of their own way of looking at things and trying to address their own biases and always improve themselves. I've found them to be very remarkable people when they're good at their job.
Well, I appreciate that opinion, Madam Chairman, but I follow the news, and I can tell you that, folks involved in the DEI arena end up in the news pretty often. I mean, we are witnessing some things in various parts of the country right now. Not to mention the lawyers involved in the former president's legal battles. The city of Boston. These are just a few of the stories that surround, DEI professionals. And I think it's quite clear that they have extreme, not only implicit, but biases that are quite, obvious that they bring with them every day on the job. And I also presume that people that choose a career in this also have very, very strong political opinions. I don't know how they're going to be mitigating those extremely strong value systems, Madam Chairman, and they're entitled to them. There is no question. But is it beneficial to the state of Connecticut and to the taxpayers who will pay millions of dollars in additional tax money to hire them to affect the policy of the state of Connecticut by using their extreme prejudice that they possess on certain types of political and cultural issues? I don't think so. There's more to the bill, although I think I'll leave it there and kind of wrap up my comments. One thing that I didn't discuss in this, and it's not because I want to go down a rabbit hole too far, but that is the subject of Marxism, which is where this all comes from. The notion of critical theory is effectively this concept that the world is divided into two categories: people who oppress others and people that are oppressed. And Karl Marx wrote extensively about this, and he thought it was the path to enlightenment and a prosperous society, at least in his writings, though in practice, Marxism has only resulted in the ability for authoritarian figures to oppress entire populations by depriving them of individual liberty and sovereignty. And for me, it's an incredible threat to our society because our society is the antithesis of Marxism. Our society is based on freedom and opportunity, not on government force redirecting resources, which is what Marxism is about. And this bill is directly about this. I find it offensive to put people into categories and refer to them as underserved communities. I find it offensive. As I started from the outset, there's only one race, the human race. Every one of our life experiences is different. And life is not fair. And sure, some people that look certain ways probably have had more tribulations in their own families and in their pasts. And certainly, generationally, that's true, especially in this country. But our goal should be to be overcoming that and reminding ourselves that we're only one race of people, and that's the color of someone's skin or their gender is completely superficial. It doesn't tell you much about their character, their skill set, what kind of person they are, whether they're honest and decent or loyal. because those things transcend all those things. And any person with a double-digit IQ ought to figure that out. People that are still practicing the idea of treating people differently based on those superficial characteristics are small, as I mentioned earlier. And we should be discouraging their advancement in our society. And I look at the entire notion of DEI as that exact thing. It's a way to put people into categories, to diminish them, to suggest that some people are inferior to others, that some people are victims, and that the only mechanism that will help them is some authoritarian figure in government that can fix it for them. That's an absurdity in this country. This country is about freedom and opportunity, and our job is to protect that for every person, to protect their rights to achieve, not to be the decider of who gets what, which is what government has become. There's much more to say on this, but I think I'll leave it there for today. This is not the path we should go down for so many reasons. Again, it's unconstitutional. There will be legal challenges. The Supreme Court has already decided this with the recent decision regarding the affirmative action in universities issue, which was specific, by the way, to government, not necessarily the private sector. And it's wrong, morally wrong, Madam Chairman. I'll be voting no.